Right, this is the process of synaptic transmission. And first of all, we'll talk about how the impulse gets across the synapse. So what happens first of all is an action potential arrives here. This is the at the axon terminal of the previous neuron. And what happens when the action potential arrives at this point is it causes a vesicle to move to the surface, and then neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. They then diffuse across the synaptic cleft and they fuse here with a receptor on the postsynaptic neuron. What then happens, if this is an excitatory neurotransmitter, what will happen is it will increase the positive charge of the postsynaptic neuron, which means the postsynaptic neuron is more likely to fire. So that's for an excitatory neurotransmitter. If, on the other hand, we have the same process occurring, let's imagine we've got an inhibitory neurotransmitter up here. Do that in red so you can see the difference. You've got an inhibitory neurotransmitter also binding with receptors on the surface. And an inhibitory neurotransmitter would make the postsynaptic neuron less likely to fire. Okay, so what then happens is we have a process, I'll just write that this is inhibitory, we have a process called summation. I'll write that down as well. And that means that basically it's the combined effect of all the different neurotransmitters on this postsynaptic neuron that determines whether or not it's likely to fire. That process is called summation. In this case, you can see, and this is obviously really simplified, but we've got one inhibitory neurotransmitter stimulating the postsynaptic neuron, making it the charge more negative. We've got one excitatory neurotransmitter stimulating, so in this case they would cancel out and nothing would happen. Let's imagine that you've got lots and lots of excitatory neurotransmitters binding with your postsynaptic neuron. What would happen is that positive charge would increase. If you imagine we've got a little graph here. We've got a threshold that we need to reach before an action potential is fired. So you can see here, we're going to, as the excitatory neurotransmitters bind and stimulate the postsynaptic neuron, make it slightly more positive. Once it reaches that threshold, an action potential is fired. That's a burst of positive potential, a burst of electrical energy. And that's your action potential. And that's basically, the action potential is as your positive electrical charge passes down the neuron. That's basically that. So if we take it to a picture of a neuron on the next page in full, let's imagine then that we had lots of excitatory neurotransmitters binding. And the sum of our excitatory neurotransmitters exceeded the sum of our inhibitory neurotransmitters, so that there were enough excitatory neurotransmitters binding to cause an action potential. That action potential, that burst of positive electrical energy, that electrical impulse is transmitted down the neuron. When it gets to this point, this is the myelin sheath here, and what happens, it then jumps. So it then travels by what's called saltatory conduction. And that means it jumps between these nodes of Ranvier. That's the gaps in the myelin sheath. That's a node of Ranvier. And the reason it does that, which is more detail than you really need to know, the reason it does that is that these inside parts of the axon become positive by ions moving in from outside. So what happens is the positive charge jumps from here to here because ions can't move in through the myelin sheath because it's being insulated. So what happens then, our action potential travels down the axon like that, and then it reaches the axon terminal down here, and then these synapses will stimulate the next neuron in the same way that we looked at on this diagram here. So the whole process starts again. The action potential arrives, it causes a neurotransmitters to be released from these vesicles into the synaptic cleft Don't forget what can happen afterwards is they can be either reuptaken back into the presynaptic neuron, or they can be destroyed by enzymes. So those are the two things that can happen afterwards. That was synaptic transmission.